Aphasia is any disruption in language production that's caused by damage to the brain. There are two types of aphasia that are described here in this part of the chapter that help us to understand how language is processed in the brain. Each of these two types of aphasia can be better understood in the context of the original case studies that led us to understand that they existed. The first was studied by Paul Broca, a French physician who met a patient named Laborn. Now, Laborn was officially his name, but many people now call him Patient Tan, because aside from one swear word, that was the only syllable that he could utter. Still, it appeared that Patient Tan could understand much of what Broca was saying to him, but he couldn't respond in a verbal fashion. For instance, when asked how long he had been hospitalized, Laborn held up 5 fingers, 5 fingers, 5 fingers, 5 fingers, and then 1 finger to indicate 21 years. Patient Tan died a short time after meeting Dr. Broca, and upon autopsy, Broca found that there was an extensive region of the left frontal lobe that had been lesioned, probably by stroke, but it's difficult to say because we don't have a lot about the patient's history. Still, you can see some pictures of the damage on page 72 of your text. In panel A of that figure, we observe the only thing that Dr. Broca was able to observe himself, just that damage on the left frontal lobe. Thankfully, Broca thought to preserve the brain for future generations of researchers to observe, and we have since been able to perform MRI analyses on the brain to observe the full extent of the damage to patient Tan's brain. As you can see in panel B, today we observe that the damage to the brain was much more extensive on the left hemisphere than just that region in the left frontal lobe. Broca believed that the damage he observed in the front left hemisphere of patient Tan's brain was the cause of the production aphasia that he observed in patient Tan. Production aphasia was patient Tan's inability to produce language. However, additional research has revealed that this area is not the only area that can result in production aphasia. Wilder Penfield was an influential neuroscientist who studied epilepsy and treated individuals for retractable epilepsy by cutting open their brain and doing brain surgery. Part of that procedure was to electrically stimulate areas of the brain to locate those areas that were responsible for necessary functions that he could not remove in the process of treating the epilepsy. You see, the treatment for epilepsy was to remove the epicenter of the epileptic seizures. Wherever the seizures began in the brain, that would be the area to remove. But if they began in an area that was critical for some function of daily life, then Wilder Penfield did not want to remove that area from the brain. So he would stimulate electrically neurons across the surface of the brain while the patient was actually awake. It's okay for a patient to be awake during brain surgery as long as they have local anesthetic to dull the pain at the area of the scalp where the scalp was cut into in order to do the surgery, because the brain doesn't have any pain receptors. So while the brain was being electrically stimulated, then they could observe the results of those electrical stimulations in the patient's body and experience. During the course of these treatments, Wilder Penfield discovered that many individuals would experience linguistic deficits when wide swaths of the left hemisphere were deadened. Sometimes those areas were specific to Broca's area, that region in the left frontal lobe, but sometimes they were a little further forward or a little further backward or a little further up or down. So there's quite a bit of variability in the region of the brain that is responsible for production of language. The other notable case study that informed our understanding of the brain's processing of language was performed by Carl Wernicke, who, as you see in the text, is spelled with a W, but because he was a German researcher, his name is pronounced as if it were a V, so Wernicke. Unlike Broca's patient, Wernicke's patient had what's called sensory or receptive aphasia, an inability to understand what other people are speaking to you. Some people characterize Wernicke's aphasia as a sparing of linguistic production. However, as you can see on page 71 in Table 3.2, The example of a patient with Wernicke's aphasia is actually pretty incomprehensible. The interesting thing about this kind of aphasia is that the individuals who have it seem to have largely intact grammar, that they understand what syntax a sentence should have, and they're able to produce lots of ordinary words. It just seems like what they say is word salad. It's a bunch of words that don't make sense together, all mixed up in a sentence. You can see on page 70 where Wernicke found the lesion to be in this patient. It's labeled Wernicke's area in figure 3.4. Now, in addition to the fact that Broca and Wernicke found their areas on the left hemisphere of the brain, we also know that the language centers of the brain are located in the left hemisphere because of the influential work in split brain patients by Michael Gazzaniga. These patients are called split brain because they've had their two hemispheres of the brain severed. Down the center of our brain, all of us have a tract of nerves that runs between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, connecting the two hemispheres and allowing them to communicate with each other. But back in the 60s, there were a set of patients who had intractable seizures, and they tried a new revolutionary technique to treat these patients by severing the corpus callosum, in other words, by separating the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. Now, most people with seizures, with epilepsy, have an epicenter of the seizures, a place where the seizures typically begin. And if we can stop the seizure from spreading in that region across the entire brain by splitting the two halves of the brain, then we can stop the seizure from becoming full-blown and taking over the entire person's brain. Now, this treatment ended up working pretty remarkably well for these patients. But by splitting the two halves of the brain, we essentially left people with two independent minds, or two independent brains. As it pertains to the study of language, the most important feature that we see here in these split brain individuals is that the language centers are exclusively located in the left hemisphere of the brain 95% of the time. For most right-handed individuals, that's the case. Left-handed individuals are a little bit wishy-washy. Sometimes they have language centers in both hemispheres of the brain, or sometimes it's actually located in the right hemisphere of the brain. Left-handed people are a little wonky in that way, but for most right-handed people, the language centers are in the left hemisphere of the brain. Now, the reason that split brain patients allowed us to know that fact was through a series of very sensitive tests that were performed with these split brain patients. Gazzaniga would present them with some information in either their left or their right visual field. Now, the way that this was done was the patients would stare at a point on the screen, and they would have presented either a word or a picture to either the left or the right of that dot. And the word or the picture was presented so rapidly that the individuals didn't have time to orient their eyes to that image. And so it was exclusively presented, regardless of whether they had one eye covered or both eyes were open, it was presented to one of the visual fields. Now, the way the brain processes vision is it takes the images on the back of the retina and it presents information from the left visual field, not from the left eye, but from the left visual field back to the right occipital lobe at the very back of the brain. And it takes information from the right visual field, not from the right eye, but from the right visual field, and projects it to the back of the left hemisphere of the brain. Now, in order to understand the full implications of this research, we have to know that the information in the left visual field is not being processed back to the right hemisphere of the brain through the corpus callosum. It's actually being processed through the brainstem. And at the brainstem, that's where we have contralateral control, or in other words, where we switch the control of the brain to the opposite half of the body. You might remember from a previous class that the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right half of the body, and the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left half of the body. So we have contralateral or opposite control of the hemispheres of the brain. But as I said, the way that that's done is at the level of the brainstem. The corpus callosum will take the information that is processed in one hemisphere of the brain and share it with the opposite hemisphere. So the information from the left visual field was still being processed by the right hemisphere of the brain, but the right hemisphere of the brain could not communicate that information to the left hemisphere. This means that when pictures or words were presented to the left visual field, and it was being processed in the right hemisphere of the brain, participants didn't recognize that something had been presented to them, and they couldn't identify what that thing was in those few instances when they did realize that something was presented to them. Sometimes they would say it was just a flash in their left visual field, but they couldn't say what that flash was. However, if the researcher, if Michael Gazzaniga, would ask the participants to take their left hand, which is under the control of their right hemisphere where the information had been sent, and draw a picture, then the participants could do that. On the other hand, if they were asked to write a word with their left hand, they couldn't do that because words are linguistically based and are mediated by the left hemisphere of the brain. So their left hand could draw a picture of what they'd seen, but it couldn't write a word, and the participant could most certainly not describe what they'd seen. Now, as the text points out to us, we can also see this lateralization effect of language in the brains of normal individuals, using the dichotic listening task. In this test, participants wear headphones that present words to both of their ears at the same time, and they're asked to report which word they heard. Now, this finding might be somewhat counterintuitive at first, but participants show a preference for reporting the word that was said to their right ear. Now, think for a second why this might be. Participants are processing information presented to their right ear in their left hemisphere, because the information from all of our senses crosses over at the level of the brainstem and is processed by the opposite half of the brain. I actually think the one exception to that rule is that the olfactory sense processes information laterally. In other words, the left nostril smells things that are processed in the left hemisphere of the brain, and the right nostril processes things in the right hemisphere of the brain. But in every other situation, we have contralateral control. This is important because in the dichotic listening test, if the information is presented to the right ear and processed in the left hemisphere of the brain, where our language centers reside, then the information processed in that ear will arrive first to the language centers, whereas the information presented to the left ear will be processed first to the right hemisphere of the brain, and then it will go across the corpus callosum back to the left hemisphere of the brain. So even though the left ear is closer to the language centers, the neural processing is actually a more indirect route to the right hemisphere and then back to the left hemisphere of the brain. So by the time the word that was presented to the left ear arrives at the left hemisphere of the brain, then the information presented to the right ear will already have been processed and have a perceptual advantage over the word presented to the left hemisphere. The findings from this task further confirm that individuals have language centers residing on the left hemisphere of their brain.